Hello, thank you all for coming here despite the promise of the thunderstorm. It means a lot. To begin, I want to say thank you to the Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira, in particular Joe Lamack and the selection committee for welcoming me into this amazing cohort of scholars who have been Quarry Farm Fellows and for inviting me to be a part of the Park Church Lecture Series. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my research with you all in this historic place, and especially as the Michael J. Csicsila Fellow. I never had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Csicsila, but my talk today builds greatly on the remarkable foundation he has set for reading Mark Twain's biography and is absolutely indebted to his work. I also want to acknowledge the support and feedback I've received from the Mark Twain Circle, who I got to discuss this project with at ALA, and the encouragement of my advisor, Shirley Samuels, who urged me to apply in the first place. To be able to continue this research in Elmira at Quarry Farm is not only really intellectually exciting for me, it's a sort of emotional experience because Elmira, as we will see, plays a really key role in the story of Langdon and the Clemens family. I'm looking forward to a very productive time here, and I'm also really thankful for the help of the center's collection manager, Katie Galvin, and the Quarry Farm caretaker, Steve Webb. The title of my talk today is Langdon's Pencil, the Infant Voice in Mark Twain's Langdon Letters, and it will move from a general introduction to a reflection on how we might read the genre of these letters, from reports of how, and it will move on to how it will move to reports on how baby Langdon developed, and then finally his untimely death. From there, I will examine how Twain narrates his son's death decades later through his daughter Susie's writing, and to conclude with a section taken from Susie's biography. It is well documented how devastatingly common child death was in the 19th century. Looking at narratives of child death in this era for my dissertation, I have been drawn to the ways that private writing often resists and pushes against typical scripts of grief, of spiritual reconciliation, submission, and the rhetoric of early lost, early saved. While Mark Twain took comfort in many of these ideas when dealing with the loss of his children, he also, in both anticipatory grief and in bereavement, refused a neat emotional resolution by seeking out ways to animate and reanimate the voices of his children, finding comfort in the thought of his children's voices through sketches, stories, and his own autobiography. Between November 7th, 1870 and June 2nd, 1872, the correspondences of Mark Twain and his wife Olivia Clemens with their friends and families are filled with reports on the condition of their firstborn son, Langdon. Langdon's premature birth and constant sicknesses filled both parents with intense anxiety. Among messages about business, Twain's letters to friends and relatives reflect on parenthood, and while on tour, Twain's letters home to Olivia end with well wishes for Langdon, or Cubby as they called him. The couple's worry would eventually prove true as Langdon died of diphtheria at 19 months old, a death made even more tragic for the Clemens' inability to travel to Elmira for Langdon's burial. In his autobiography, Twain would later confess he blamed himself for Langdon's death. In my talk today, I'm going to mostly move chronologically through letters between Mark Twain and Olivia Clemens. I will refer to them as Twain and Olivia, perhaps a bit awkwardly, but I think this will ensure clarity, and letters to and from family members or close friends. As I examine Twain's struggle with Langdon's uncertain health over this period, I am especially interested in letters where Twain ventriloquizes his son to friends and family. Writing a small handful of letters from Langdon, Twain reflects on, imagines, and exaggerates what he believes to be the thoughts in his son's mind. I find these letters, which are written largely in late 1870, shortly after Langdon's birth, very curious. Bringing in later letters from Twain and Olivia which reflect on Langdon's development and speech, I suggest that we should read this body of letters as more than just lighthearted jests. Rather, I argue that infant speech indexes a number of Twain's anxieties and literary concerns in this roughly 2-year period. Twain's invented scenes of infant writing and speech comically undermine the etymology of infant. ENFANS quite literally means without speech. The inaccessibility of the infant consciousness and 19th century literary efforts to give voice to it have been a long-held curiosity for writers, as well as a concern for scholars of children's literature and children in literature. The child's consciousness of the world before language was often imagined as a state of innocence and free of socialization. Yet, Twain's writing voice for Langdon is not a romantic exercise in rendering what Samuel Taylor Coleridge called a state so godlike. Neither is it exactly the manipulative one noted in Elizabeth Goodenough, Mark A. Herbley, and Naomi Sokoloff's Infant Tongues, where, quote, child-centered writing is never free from adult concerns, whether to indoctrinate young minds or to wrest young minds free of conventional assumptions, end quote. Instead, Twain eschews the world of beautiful childhood innocence that was so ubiquitous in the sentimental texts of the 19th century, a literary mode that many have tied to systems of moral and social instruction. The voice Twain invents for Langdon is witty, occasionally puzzled at his surroundings to comedic effect, and humorously world-weary at the fuss around him. There's little in these letters that suggests that Twain wanted to reproduce a truly childlike voice as he did in later works like Tom Sawyer. At the same time, this exercise undoubtedly captures how Twain animated his idea of Langdon's future voice through this literary play, and consequently how these correspondences also shaped what sort of place Langdon might take within the Clemens family and social circle. For example, we have two letters in November 1870, shortly after the birth of Langdon, from the perspective of the newborn. The first to Eunice Ford, Langdon's 88-year-old great-grandmother, and the second to close friends Joseph H. and Harmony C. Twitchell. These two letters reveal a delicate balance of tone, as the baby's perspective is filled with endearing descriptions of his family and bodily functions, as well as concerns about health and mortality that the baby cannot, in this shared fantasy, yet articulate. To Ford, Clemens begins the letter with a playful opening. Do not tell Grandma who the letter is from. Let her find out as she goes along. It opens with an impatient and indignant writer criticizing Ford for not writing before the reveal. I am 4 days old today at 11 o'clock. Baby Langdon reports on his low weight, his bathing habits, his gas, his appearance with humor and lightheartedness. I have a ridiculous time of it with clothes, Langdon shares. I am only 13 inches long, and these things, slips, are as much as 3 feet. He also writes, I am not entirely satisfied with my complexion. I am as red as a lobster. I am really ashamed to see company. To make these alarming features inconveniences, Twain downplays Langdon's state of health, either for his benefit or Ford's. Though Twain's playful report hints at Langdon's precarious state, the Langdon letters do not betray the fear that he had that same week, which he confides to his brother Orion Clemens. I do not believe the baby will live 5 days. To the Twitchells addressed as uncle and aunt, Twain as Langdon describes again his wretched health as a newborn. I am not corpulent, nor am I robust in any way. At birth, I only weighed 4.5 pounds with my clothes on, and the clothes were the chief feature of the weight, too, I am obliged to confess. He adds, they all say I look very old and venerable, and I am aware myself that I never smile. Life seems a serious thing, what I have seen of it, and my observation teaches me that it is made up mainly of hiccups, unnecessary washings, and wind in the bowels. Though this assertion turns into a joke about bowels, a reoccurring theme, life was indeed a serious thing at this point in the family's life. The Clemenses saw no shortage of tragedy before Langdon's birth. This included the death of Olivia's father, as well as her close friend Emma Nye, and after Olivia's near-death encounter with typhoid fever. This letter then provides not only comedic relief from this atmosphere of tragedy and fear, it also functions as a kind of reassurance. As Twain's Langdon narrates his own arrival, stating, I was not due here on this planet until about the first week in December. We appear to be all right now. The temporal play is evident. Twain uses this imaginary precocity to project a more intellectually and developmentally advanced Langdon, The style is a humorous attempt to correct or even combat the worry surrounding Langdon's prematurity. It is not easy to categorize these letters. As private correspondences, they are historical texts to fill in the blanks of Twain's biography, yet they are also imaginative literary exercises. Why report on the state of a newborn this way? Why create this imaginary exchange where the infant has taken the pen and speaks directly to the grandmother, uncle, or aunt? While no part of these letters can be called children's fiction, again, these are private letters among adults, and no part of them aspire to be pedagogical or publishable, I have found studies of children's literature and children's writing useful in trying to untangle the playful ventriloquism in these letters. If the trap of children's fiction is, as Jacqueline Rose writes, the impossible rupture in which, quote, the adult comes first, author, maker, giver, and the child comes after as reader, product, receiver, but where neither of them enter the space in between, end quote, Twain crafts a fiction which foregrounds the absurdity of such a literary endeavor. That is, the humor of the Langdon persona showcases the impossibility of voicing children, making visible the exaggerated eloquence of many child characters in popular fiction, and the fact that fictional children are, more often than not, literary vessels or symbols. These letters are challenging to unpack not only because of their unique nature, but also because they operate both parallel to and against the common impulses of writings for and about children. When Rose assesses Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie's famous story of a child who never ages, she argues that the glorification of children in 19th century literature and culture is not simply an effort to obscure the, quote, difficulties and contradictions of the child, but rather to deny those same difficulties in relation to ourselves. Therefore, Rose argues children's fiction constantly replays this implication and, quote, has never completely severed its links with a philosophy which sets up the child as a pure point of origin in relation to language, sexuality, and the state, end quote. Twain's Langdon letters constantly focus on origin, yet he also inverts Barrie's Peter Pan and its fixation on eternal youth. These letters may record the details of Langdon's infantile state, but rather than preserving his state of youth, they seem to urge him to grow up more quickly, to grow rebellious, and to energetically clash against his father. That, of course, does not heal or close the rupture between speaker and addressee, or the gap between adult and child, which Rose identifies. Rather, Twain's Langdon letters embody the same impossibility of children's fiction Rose notes when she writes, if children's fiction builds an image of the child inside the book, it does so in order to secure the child who is outside the book, the one who does not come so easily within its grasp. Even without the child as addressee, what we find in Twain's letters as Langdon is an attempt to secure and to convert his unspeaking infant into a subject, or rather a persona. The role of humor here is essential, as it understands the act of writing a child's address as an eternal exercise in projection and play. The ruse is clear, and yet Langdon the child remains just outside the circle of communication established by the Langdon persona. Additionally, if there's anyone whose humorous exercises in children's voices feels worthy of scholarly attention, it is certainly Mark Twain, whose literary characters have become icons and emblems of American childhood. My title today, Langdon's Pencil, is a nod to Stephen Mintz's Huck's Raft, A History of American Childhood, which adopts Huck's Raft as a central metaphor for the history of children in America. For Mintz, the raft tells the story of a journey that is at times carefree and at other times dangerous and carried by raging currents, both environmental and social, one that, quote, encapsulates the modern conception of childhood as a period of peril and freedom, an odyssey of psychological self-discovery and growth, and a world apart with its own values, culture, and psychology. The infant voice, as opposed to the child voice, is a similar yet uniquely challenging world for Twain to render. And while he does not take this task of rendering the infant voice seriously when he adopts the Langdon persona, that does not make the infant state any less perilous, nor does it exempt Langdon from questions of discipline, development, schooling, or inheritance. And while I maintain a somewhat hazy boundary between fiction and nonfiction, other scholars have made more direct formulations between Twain's biography and his literary writing. In addition to works which reflect on children's voices, my project builds on scholarship centered on Twain's experiences as a parent and his familiarity with loss. These letters about Langdon, with particular attention to the Clemens' emotions during this period, have been detailed by Barbara E. Snedecor in American Literary Realism. Following Snedecor, Joseph Csicsila has argued that Langdon's death had an incredibly deep impact on Twain, pointing out that Langdon has often been a curious gap in Twain's scholarship, especially when the deaths of Twain's brother Henry, his daughters, and his wife have been given a comparatively large amount of critical attention. And in May, Csicsila and I were on a panel together where he gave a great paper on the changes in Twain's dialogue for children before and after Langdon's death. Similarly, Michael J. Csicsila writes in a study of how Twain's domestic life and family shaped his fiction that, quote, Clemens irrevocably lost his innocence with the death of his son. Csicsila argues that Twain's silence on Langdon, likely the reason for this gap in scholarship, should be understood as an expression of both the, quote, depths of his loss and the anxiety of his own misplaced culpability. Csicsila also, in Mark Twain at Home, conjectures a relationship between the ubiquitous absent parents of Twain's major fiction and the Clemens' absence at Langdon's burial. Csicsala's thoughts on Twain's silence echo those of Twain's close friend William Dean Howells, who wrote he, quote, never heard Twain speak of his son except that once, but no doubt in his deep heart his loss was irreparably present. As Csicsila, and others have suggested, Twain also repeatedly wrote his deceased family members into both his fiction and nonfiction. However, my talk today is less interested in the relationship between Twain's life and his fiction. Rather, I aim to consider the way that narrative and the imitation of infant language, particularly speech, and the act of writing functions in Twain's Langdon letters, which combine humor and imagination with a desire to report on the state of the family and forge connections. In this regard, Twain's Langdon persona shows the writer adopting a form of apostrophe in Barbara Johnson's definition, quote, a form of ventriloquism through which the speaker throws voice, life, and human form into the addressee, turning its silence into mute responsiveness. Crucially, Twain's letters repeatedly stage failed animation and undoes his own work. This imagined Langdon repeatedly states that he does not wish to have any words and refuses to answer right off. His language is conjured only to be edited and corrected, rebuked by another writer, or crossed out on the page. Like Johnson's reading of Baudelaire's Moesta e Erabunda, Twain's Langdon persona is often at odds with itself. Twain's letters, like Johnson's Baudelaire, enacts, quote, in its own temporality, the loss of animation is situates in the temporality of the speaker's life. What the poem ends up wanting to know is not how far childhood is, but whether its own rhetorical strategies can be effective. The final question becomes, can this gap be bridged? Can this loss be healed through language alone? End quote. I will return to this question near my conclusion, where I look at representations of Langdon in Twain's autobiography, representations that appear through the animation of Susie as a co-writer. So far I have talked about how Twain's invention of the infant voice rubs against 19th century conventions of children's writing, and how Langdon has been taken up in Twain's scholarship. I've done this through a brief examination of letters to Ford and the Twitchells, both of which were composed a few days after Langdon's birth. I'm now going to turn to in more detail at how the Langdon persona was cultivated by Twain and also Mary Mason Fairbanks through a series of other correspondences and images, before turning to how this persona compared to the actual Langdon's speech development. From the start of this persona, the nature of Langdon's language reveals a thread of inquiry surrounding inheritance and legacy, namely, how much would Langdon be like his father? Twain likely wrote another of these letters in Langdon's voice around the time of Langdon's birth to Mary Mason Fairbanks to announce the news, but this letter is now lost. We have no copy of it. We know of its likely existence through a reply from Fairbanks kept in Olivia's commonplace book addressing Langdon in the light of his safe arrival. This is, I believe, the only example we have of someone writing back to Langdon. We do not know whether others enjoyed participating in this game, but Fairbanks did. The loving grandmother, so signed as Twain often affectionately called Fairbanks' mother, notes that his early arrival is, quote, another marked resemblance to the head of the house. Fairbanks also jokes about the word choices, writing, evidently, however, you are a stranger in these parts and are not familiar with my idiosyncrasies, else your first greeting would not have been so familiar or so slangy. Fairbanks' sense of humor is clearly on display in this letter as she adopts what she calls the prerogative of all grandmothers, of annihilating in your nature all tendencies that remind me of your father's shortcomings. This joke about Langdon's habits resembling his father continues throughout the letter. Of Olivia's influence, Fairbanks notes that the more you have of her nature, the less I shall have to do. In one of these jokes, Fairbanks' tone takes on a conspicuously literary nature. I have spoken only of your father because in my introduction to his son, I have felt impressed with the importance of at once revising and correcting this pocket edition. Here, to correct Langdon's speech is to correct his character. Whether this joke about the son as a pocket edition of the father is a joke from Fairbanks or a playful response to something in Twain's original letter, we do not know. Nevertheless, the editorial language of revision and correction in Fairbanks' letter reflects the centrality of language and literacy in 19th century child rearing. Thus, Fairbanks' stated task of guiding the infant Langdon is both a familial and literary one. The title of Pocket Edition also reminds us of the intensity with which Twain's identity is tied to his own writing, and how the precarious Langdon, an infant who has not yet met many of his family members, is similarly a figure made legible and addressable through writing. After all, in this lost letter, which contained Fairbanks' first introduction to the baby, all she has is the text. Langdon is, in many respects, a literary character. Twain's willingness to playfully write about his sick son this way is fascinating, as he specifically wrote to the writer and editor Jesse C. Haney not long after Langdon's birth, I don't mind being caricatured myself, but don't put in my baby. If I was sure it was going to live, I wouldn't care, but its health is so precarious that I hardly dare utter a pleasantry about the little fellow, lest he pass from us and leave it looking ghastly in print. Twain was then very cautious about his Langdon persona being a private one, and as we see from this letter, his appearance in print was controlled. That Langdon did or could resemble his father is an ongoing theme in the Clemens' letters, from Snedecor's suggestion that Twain saw his own premature birth in Langdon, to the fact that Twain clearly delighted in crafting a slangy and rebellious infant voice that resembled his own. You will likely catch that this talk often conflates writing with speaking, a pattern which comes from the simple fact that we do not know of Langdon's speech without a written record, but also because I'm taking a cue from Twain. Twain's Langdon persona loved slang and rebelled against any effort to correct his language. In a letter on November 20th, 1870, Twain crafts another invented dialogue to thank his brother-in-law Charlie for a pair of shoes. This time, he describes a conversation between Langdon and himself. After Langdon exclaims upon seeing the shoes, "Scold those things right over here, for I'm about tired going barefoot in the wintertime, you bet your life." After Twain scolds Langdon, saying, "My son, slang is a thing I will not permit in this house," Langdon replies, "I do not wish to have any words with you," old man is crossed out, "father, but if whenever you find that the nature of my conversation is not suited to your appetite, you suppose you get up on your ear and take a walk round the block." We can almost see the wink in his eye when Twain continues, "I cannot think where the child got its unhappy proclivity for slang, for from the beginning it has been my earnest endeavor to make its speech as free from anything of that kind as my own." Though Twain ascribes a natural defiance to his child in his Langdon persona, one that notably resembles his own proclivities and public persona, Twain repeatedly comments on Langdon's good behavior in other letters. Langdon was in fact likely a very quiet child. From here, I'm going to be largely looking at letters about Langdon rather than Langdon persona letters. The same day or the day before Twain wrote this imagined argument with his son, he sent 2 views of Langdon Clemens thinking to Susan L. Crane, 2 pencil drawings of his sleeping son. The peaceful expression in this drawing has little of that viciousness he playfully ventriloquizes, though the specificity of thinking rather than sleeping, and the scribble that may be a furrowed brow suggests that there is more happening in Langdon's brain than we can detect. To Joseph Twitchell in December of 1870, he writes of the almost 2-month-old boy, "I don't have to quiet him. He hardly ever utters a cry. He is always thinking about something. He is a patient, good little baby." In a Christmas letter to Eunice Ford that same year, signed by Twain as Langdon, Twain attaches an image of Langdon which his son in his persona jokingly states, "is a small personal friend of mine who has gotten over his crimson period, his yaller period, and his red gum period." He continues, "He has a good many virtues, but his chiefest one is his mannerly and attractive quietness. He never speaks till he is spoken to, and even then he don't answer right off." This contrast between the rebellious and slangy Langdon of Twain's letters and the quiet cubby may gain a new meaning with Twain's later reports on the slow progress of his son's development. In April 22, 1871, when Langdon is nearly half a year old, he writes to Charles Dudley and Susan Warner, "His teeth don't come, and neither does his language." We can picture the Clemenses awaiting Langdon's language, which Twain suggests is as natural as the growth of teeth. Twain's letters fixate often on Langdon's language. When Langdon is around 1, he writes to Olivia, "Bless your heart, I appreciate the cubby, and shall more and more as he develops and becomes vicious and interesting. To me, he is a very, very dear little rip. Kiss him for me, sweetheart. I have ordered the songbook for him." The operative word is, of course, shall. Here, Twain jokingly or not jokingly gestures at a closer relationship to a speaking Langdon who will be vicious and interesting, a voice which may be ushered in by the songbook, a classic object of infant education. Twain's promise that his appreciation for Langdon will grow is also a curious one that may betray a greater anxiety between the couple, as statements like this appear occasionally in their correspondences. Despite some of these early concerns, his teeth did come, and to some extent so did his language, and these reports often arrive together. Olivia writes when Langdon is 14 months old that, "I have been having a good time with baby part of the day today. He is a glorious little fellow. He has his 2nd tooth. He has twice today said something very like Papa. I talk Papa at him a good deal of the time." This letter conjures images of Olivia urging Langdon to mimic her speech, yet the phrasing here of "talk Papa at him" as opposed to something like "talk about Papa" or "say Papa" captures the tangled nature of address at the beginning of language recognition. Talk implies some kind of exchange embedded in Langdon's mimicry, while "at" suggests one-sidedness. This dynamic of talking "at" captures the sense that Langdon is just on the edge of a world of language, but also uncovers Olivia's eager attempts to form a bond between Twain and Langdon across a physical distance. Twain at this point was away from home on a 5-month lecture from October 1871 to March 1872, and in this time, Langdon was 11 to 16 months old. Langdon is often only a small note in letters from Twain to Olivia in this time, mentioned only in brief regards, like "kiss the cubby for me." Moreover, Langdon is notably peripheral for much of this period to the extent that Csicsila, following Twain biographer Ron Powers' observation that there is a sense of detachment operating in later letters that mention Langdon, ties this detachment to a kind of anticipatory grief. This is Csicsila, resonant with the couple's constant mention of what should happen if either Langdon or the newly pregnant Livy were to pass away. In one letter in early 1871, he addresses Olivia's fears directly. Twain attempts to soothe her by saying, "It isn't worthwhile to think about it or talk about it. Don't fret for us, darling. If you are taken away, I will love the baby and have a jealous care over him. But let us hope and trust that both you and I shall tend him and watch over him till we are helped from our easy chairs to the parlor to see his children married. Despite Twain's attempts to assure Olivia that they should not think or talk about it, again by painting an image of Langdon far in the future, the couple remained fretful over the uncertain health of both mother and son. Examining their correspondences during Twain's lecture tour, it's clear that Olivia understood how the infant voice, whether projected or real, loomed over and seemed key to Twain's capacity for affection or attachment to his son. In a letter during the first few months of Twain's lecture tour, Olivia also wrote to her husband, "I know as he grows older, you and he will love each other like everything." Crucially, while Olivia also often participates in voicing Langdon, she never goes as far as to actually give him his own dialogue. Her letters focus more on Langdon's feelings, which sometimes mirror her own. "Cubby is very anxious to have you home Saturday. He hopes that you will not fail us on any account. And mother sends love, and I know the cubby wants to, but poor little fellow, he cannot speak yet, though he certainly has a speaking face." In these scenes, both Twain and Olivia make a character out of their unspeaking son, while also projecting their own hopes for Langdon's development. We have a look at this speaking face in the following picture. Twain again signed a message as Langdon when sending a photograph of Langdon and Susan Crane to Bret Harte in 1871, taken in May of that year. From the photo studio of Johnny Larkin in Elmira, the inscription reads, "The most determined singer in America sends his warm regards to the most notorious one. The lady is his aunt, who sat for his mother and did it very well indeed, with the exception of resemblance, she broke down there." With this photo and inscription, Twain again makes mention of Langdon's almost speech by playfully comparing his noise and crying with song, and even drawing a humorous connection with Harte's writing. Very soon, we see that Olivia's efforts to talk Papa apparently paid off. Olivia reports on a 13-month-old Langdon that when we say, "Where is Papa?" he looks right at your picture that stands on the bureau. Months later, we get another mention of language in a letter to Fairbanks. Twain writes that the 15-month-old boy, flourishing wonderfully, can say "pa" and knows enough to indicate which parent he means by it, which is Margaret the nurse. Twain also notes that Langdon cannot walk yet, but that is, quote, "not backwards of development physically, but precocity of development intellectually, so to speak, since it is development of inherited indolence, acquired from his father. Indolence is an intellectual faculty, I believe." These final lines again bring us back to Twain's identification with his son and his desire to, however jokingly, convert what may appear as backwardness, as related to Langdon's prematurity, to insubordinate precocity. I think it is very telling that Langdon's repetitions or articulations of "pa" are the only accounts we have of the child's speech in the Clemens letters. While Twain displayed his own desire for a son that spoke like him in his letters, Olivia urged Langdon to speak to Twain in a show of recognition. This humorous mention of Margaret misidentified as "pa" initially read to me as almost a refusal on Twain's part to be identified, a tragic proof of Olivia's forced efforts to make Langdon recognize his father and the impact of Twain's absence for those 5 months. It resembles an earlier sentence where in "I do not wish to have any words with you, father," there is a visual delay through the correction from "old man," which was crossed out, to "father." Mistaken or delayed identification seems to be a consistent theme throughout Twain's letters, as Langdon's need for a correction allows Twain to imagine his son's grasp for words and the recognition they imply. Yet this following statement about inherited indolence permits Twain to read Langdon's misidentification or perceived belatedness as willful. I want to put a small pin in this anecdote, as when we turn to Twain's autobiography, we will see that misdirected words may still find their subject belatedly or indirectly. As I said at the beginning, I've been moving chronologically through the Clemens' letters in this talk, beginning in Langdon's newborn days in late 1870, where we observe the majority of the Langdon persona, to other dispatches from 1871 on Langdon's development, to his attempts at speech from late 1871 to early 1872. However, I also want to acknowledge that in addition to some lost letters, like Twain's initial letter to Fairbanks, we also have long stretches of time without any significant reports on Langdon, as well as notable gaps in known correspondence throughout 1872. We have no known letters by the couple between May 26 and June 11, 1872, but know from accounts from Lily Warner and Susan Crane that in this period, the Clemens' 2-month-old Susie was baptized, and that the family went to Hartford, where Langdon's health took a turn for the worst. After Langdon passed on June 2nd, the boy's body was brought to Elmira and buried in the family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery. Neither Twain nor Olivia attended, as Olivia's health was too fragile, and so the parents remained in Hartford. In a letter to Louise Chandler Moulton 2 weeks after Langdon's death, Twain responds to Moulton's condolences, writing, "And I thank you also for expressing your kindly and thoroughly welcome sympathy for our irreparable loss. We did feel such a jubilant pride in our boy. You know how honest is the conviction that the child that is gone was the one only spirit that was perfect. When we shall feel reconciled, God only can tell. To us, it seems a faraway time indeed." As previously mentioned, Twain spoke very little about Langdon following his death, though Csicsila has suggested we can read much of Twain's grief and mourning for Langdon in Tom Sawyer, which he began shortly after in the summer months of 1872. Going forward, around 3 decades after Langdon's death, I now bring us to Twain's autobiography, or more accurately, his daughter Susie's biography, as it was incorporated into the dictations and excerpts that would eventually become Twain's autobiography. I moved to Twain's autobiography not only because it is where we find mentions of Langdon and these 2 torturous years once again, but because it is another place where we observe Twain once again deferring to the child's voice. This time, however, it is no longer as imitation or ventriloquism. Instead, this retrospective is framed by the 13-year-old Susie's voice as passages from Papa, an intimate biography of Mark Twain, opens these chapters, a kind of epigraph, prelude, or introduction that creates the sense of a memory told within a memory. This dynamic reverses the ventriloquism of the Langdon letters, as the Papa excerpts come from Susie's attempt to write and construct the narrative of her father's life. The following passages all come from autobiographical dictations taken by Josephine Hobby and Albert Bigelow Paine that were eventually collected for Twain's autobiography. Some were published initially in chapters for the North American Review, then in various editions, and then finally as a comprehensive collection by the Mark Twain Project. And this is what these sections look like. In Twain's autobiography, Langdon's fate is first told through Susie, whose biography states, "When in Elmira, Langdon began to fail, but I think Mama did not know just what was the matter with him." It is in the mode of elaborating on Susie's account or correcting her record that Twain makes the confession that he believed himself the cause of the child's illness for accidentally exposing him to the cold on a coach ride. He states, "I have always felt shame for that treacherous morning's work and have not allowed myself to think of it when I could help it. I doubt if I had the courage to make confession at the time. I think it most likely that I have never confessed until now." As mentioned before, many have speculated it was the sense of guilt combined with grief that led Twain to share very little about Langdon in his writing and correspondences after the family's loss. It is also crucial to mention here that Twain took on a significant part of this autobiographical endeavor after Susie's death at 24 in 1896. The inclusion of her biography is a testament to Twain's admiration for his daughter and his early hope that Susie would make writing her vocation. Csicsila describes much of Twain's work on the autobiography as an effort to, quote, "bring her back to life," or as Twain put it in his notebook, "to speak to my dead child." In this sense, children's writing, in the form of Susie's biography, functions to animate her memory, just as Langdon's imagined speech animated the infant to make a non-speaking subject addressable. Here, I want to draw our attention towards the ways in which Twain's autobiography, much like the Langdon persona letters, concerns itself with speech, delayed speech, and silence when confronting grief. For instance, Twain narrates receiving the news of Susie's death, which was relayed by cablegram, as an experience where the, quote, intellect is stunned by the shock, and but gropingly gathers the meaning of the words, that the mind has a dumb sense of vast loss, and that it will be years before the tale of lost essentials is complete. In addition, Twain takes great comfort in the knowledge of Susie's last word, where his daughter, blinded and delirious from the meningitis that suddenly took her, holds the hand of the family's maid and says, "Mama," in a beautiful allusion of the absent Olivia. Olivia, at the moment of Susie's turn for the worse, was traveling to America. It was only one word that she said when she spoke that last time, and it told of her longing. She groped with her hands and found Katie, and caressed her face and said, "Mama." How gracious it was that in that forlorn hour of wreck and ruin, with the night of death closing around her, she should have been granted that beautiful illusion, that the latest vision which rested upon the clouded mirror of her mind should have been the vision of her mother, and the latest emotion she should know in life, the joy and peace of that dear imagined presence. Twain frames Susie's deathbed illusion as a regression back into a time of childhood or infancy. Around this passage, he also includes various details that evoke this stage of life, like the fact that they are in the, quote, home of her childhood and always the dearest place in the earth to her, that she was surrounded by those who had known her from the cradle, and that Katie had begun to serve us when Susie was a child of 8 years. That this latest vision is a scene of misrecognition, again of the caregiver misidentified as parent, if we recall Langdon's paw directed at Margaret, aligns the scene of Susie's death with earlier scenes from Langdon's infancy. In both Langdon's paw and Susie's mama, the fact that the call is actually directed towards someone other than the parent is beside the point. That is not to minimize the presence of Margaret and Katie or the significant role domestic labor and nurses in particular played in the Clemens household. In fact, the way that numerous nursemaids appear throughout the infancy and childhood of the Clemens children shows us that they were quite a prominent caretaking and socializing force in the family. Katie Leary, who worked for the Twain family for 30 years, would go on to publish her own book about this time titled A Lifetime with Mark Twain, where she also recounts this moment. Rather, my reading of these scenes where Margaret and Katie are called Pa or Mama is that it is the simple act of calling for the parent and thinking them there, which comforts and assures the parent of their relationship. Having examined the temporal manipulation of Twain's letters on Langdon, which are animated by anticipatory grief, a concern with belatedness or prematurity, and an imagined precocity, it is striking how this fixation on speech from the early 1870s returns again over 30 years later in Twain's descriptions of losing the adult Susie. That the editors of the Mark Twain Project call many of these autobiographical dictations and drafts false starts feels appropriate. Not only do these excerpts show Twain abandoning and restarting the process of speaking his own narrative, the experimental nature reveals a continued difficulty in converting the aforementioned dumb sense of vast loss into a, quote, complete tale of lost essentials. How might these earlier letters, which cautiously and humorously contemplate Langdon's voice, help us look into a more complete tale of Langdon's loss and absence beyond Twain's intense sense of guilt? What does it mean that he incorporates the teenage Susie's writing to accompany him when he revisits this moment decades later? I conclude with a dictation taken on February 16th, 1906, which offers an unassuming but extremely telling image of Langdon at play. This section begins with teenage Susie's description of Langdon. Quote, "He used to carry a pencil in his little hand. That was his great plaything. I believe he was very seldom seen without one in his hand." This great pencil in Langdon's little hand is a central symbol to this project. While Langdon was never literate, and we may presume only rarely spoken words, his great plaything was nevertheless the most fundamental tool for language and writing, and one which ties him to his father. In his autobiography, Twain leaves the story from Susie without comment. His recollection 3 decades after the recounted events begins with the statement, "Susie is right," and is largely about the period's big incidents. This included the family's year of mourning, the restlessness, and the details of their move from Buffalo to Hartford. Yet it seems apparent that the scene is something that could only have been recounted to Susie by her parents, or possibly others close to them, since she herself was only 2 months old when Langdon passed. As the voice of a teenage Susie makes these accounts of Langdon speakable, the sense of repetition and of imitating her parents' words still remain. Most importantly, we see how even after Langdon's untimely death, the Clemenses still maintained a kind of mythology or image of their firstborn son as someone who could wield the tools of writing and articulation, that their desire to hear Langdon's voice, once expressed in these playful letters or in scenes of hopeful mimicry, still remained in the story of his great pencil. Thank you.